Good afternoon, and welcome to the JCC of Metro Detroit's 69th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. I am Sandy Matz, and I'm one of the Associate Chairs of the Book Fair. It is my pleasure to welcome you this Sunday afternoon to hear Amy Schwartz, author of Can Robots Be Jewish? Inspirational Rabbis Answer Pressing Questions of Modern Life. This weekend, we are honoring all of our patrons. Their support helps make this event possible, and especially this year when faced with so much uncertainty. We are deeply grateful for their commitment to Book Fair and the art of Jewish storytelling. So please join us in thanking our patrons. If you like, you can leave a note of thanks in the comments or reach out to all the Book Fair patrons in your life. And while we can't give you the collective round of applause that you deserve, we hope you, our patrons, feel our appreciation for making the virtual book fair a reality this year. The goal of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair is to bring the best new Jewish books and authors from around the world to Metro Detroit. This year, the rooms we're all sitting in may be different, but that purpose remains. The book fair runs through December 9th, and still we have an exceptional lineup of events planned. To see our full event schedule, learn about ways to support Book Fair, watch events you may have missed, and find our online store where you can find Can Robots Be Jewish? And plenty of other hand-selected books and gifts, visit our website at culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. This year, in order to provide as much programming to the community as possible, we've made all of our events free of charge. So while I know you'll enjoy this event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to Book Fair. You can do both at our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. We rely on community support to make this annual event possible. So thank you in advance for becoming part of the family. The Book Fair team would like to thank the following sponsors for their support of today's program. Our day sponsor is Reva and Robert Rosen, and our co-sponsor is the Isaac Agri Downtown Synagogue. We have a really special event for you today, and we want you to be a part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comment section below or by texting the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they will take as many questions as they can. While you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way you'll never miss any of our exciting events. The focus of today's event is, Can Robots Be Jewish? Inspirational Rabbis Answer Pressing Questions of Modern Life. We have with us author of the book, Amy Schwartz, as well as Rabbi Aaron Bergman of Adat Shalom Synagogue, who will moderate the discussion. When Moment magazine arrives every month, loyal readers turn to the Ask the Rabbis column featuring rabbis who represent the range of Jewish thought: independent, humanist, Jewish renewal, reconstructionist, reform, conservative, Orthodox, Sephardic, and Chabad. Can Robots Be Jewish? Gathers the highlights of this column from over the year, where these rabbis consider some of the most provocative questions of the day and show Judaism's ongoing engagement with modernity. Amy Schwartz, longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, is editor of Moment magazine's Ask the Rabbi section. She has worked at Harper's, The New Republic, and the Wilson Quarterly, and is also the president of the Multi-Denominational Jewish Studies Center in Washington, D.C. Rabbi Aaron Bergman, rabbi of Adat Shalom Synagogue, is a Detroit native and a graduate of the University of Michigan. He was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary and pursued additional graduate work in Jewish folklore at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. You might want to ask him about his own Ask the Rabbi. Please join me in welcoming Amy Schwartz and Rabbi Aaron Bergman.
All right, thank you, Sandy. Just so happy to be here, especially to be able to chat with the author of this wonderful book, of Amy Schwartz. When I first heard about the book itself, I was really intrigued just with the title. I grew up in the 60s and 70s with the Jetsons, Lost in Space, Star Trek, and I thought for sure by now I'd have like a jetpack and I'd be flying around. And when you think about, Lost in Space took place in the 1990s, which was so far in the future. So the title was really intriguing to me, but the book is so much more. You deal with issues of science, sex, modern lifestyles, values, politics, the nature of the universe. And so just tell me how this book came together. What was your inspiration for it? And also, why did you lead with the title of Can Robots Be Jewish? And again, anyone who's watching this, please put your questions in the comments and we'll share them with Amy.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. And thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. And thank you for that lovely introduction. Sandy explained a little bit about Ask the Rabbis, the column that the book is based on, but I'll answer the question in two parts. So the first answer is simply, I edit this feature, Ask the Rabbis, and it's very popular. People seem to love it, and there are a lot of reasons people like it. It gives you a wide range of Jewish thought. It gives you a lot of immediate, sort of useful information. But let me start by saying, suppose, has anybody ever come to you and said, so, what do Jews believe about the afterlife? Or, can Jews get tattoos? I mean, it's not just rabbis who get these questions. People often ask this. And if you've ever had these questions, if you've ever been struck by one of these questions, you know that in good internet fashion, you usually say, well, it's complicated. Any conversation about what Jews believe about anything is going to be a really long conversation. So now turn it around. Say you have a question like this and you decide, instead of just Googling the answer, or asking Rabbi Bergman, you're going to ask 10 different rabbis. And you're going to ask this array of rabbis ranging from humanists to Chabad and sometimes beyond. You'll get answers, all right. You'll end up with so many answers that you're going to emerge with a whole lot of new questions. And in other words, you will come away with a dose of a very important kind of specifically Jewish wisdom. So that's really why we created Ask the Rabbis. We thought the sum of Jewish wisdom and Jewish disagreement on any question is larger than its parts. So that you always come out with more. So every month we try to think of a question that will get people thinking, both the rabbis and the readers. We don't want questions that they can answer easily and factually. And we don't want questions that just say, well, this one thinks this and that one thinks that, and that's the end of it. So we ask them to answer this question. We've asked them all kinds of questions, including the two I mentioned at the outset. Can Jews get tattoos? And do Jews believe in an afterlife? We've asked, obviously, the question, can robots be Jewish? One of our favorite question. And I'll get to that. I'll get to that next, because that's definitely the question that brought the rabbi in. We've asked the rabbis to apply Jewish law or tradition to contemporary problems. For instance, what does Jewish tradition think about organ donation or about editing our children's genes? We've asked them to philosophize, are there things that can't be forgiven? We've asked them, are Jews still waiting for a Messiah? And we ask them to answer the question in 200 words or less. They hate this. 200-word answers are not most rabbis' default mode, let's just say.
We can't say hello in 200 words.
Right. Well, I used to be an editorial writer, and we had to stick to 500 words, and that's also very difficult. But the results are always worth the struggle. So we've asked we ask these questions. Of course, we come out with a lot of disagreement. The rabbis are a fabulous array. In some sense, these rabbis don't agree on anything. At the one end of the spectrum, you have the humanist rabbis who, and I've noticed this among several humanist rabbis, so it can't be just one guy. They can't answer a question without making it clear that they do not believe in God or any supernatural effect on history. That's the brand. Like, we are Jewish humanists and we don't believe in God. And at the other end, you have the Orthodox and Chabad rabbis who believe so deeply that they won't write the name of God. They'll spell it G-D. And anyone who's grown up around in Orthodox or traditional communities is familiar with this practice. You're echoing the practice of avoiding speaking the divine name in Hebrew. And, in Hebrew, people will usually say Hashem, the name. So that's to be expected. But then you have the Jewish renewal rabbis, who you might say they're in the middle, you might say they're a little bit to the left. And the Jewish renewal rabbis are very liberal in a lot of ways, but they also resonate to Hasidic practices. And so they've taken this idea of not writing the name of God up, but because they're an enthusiastic bunch, a bunch of them spell God G!D. So I love this. I think this is a great practice, but the people who are driven completely distraught by it are Moments proofreaders. So if you're a proofreader, you think, well, we're going to spell it one way. That's magazine form. I considered this one of my early successes. Sorry, did you want to say something?
No, but I was thinking what the spelling is that I've gotten 8 questions this week. How do you spell Hanukkah?
There you go. Right. Jews can't agree on anything. Right. But for good reasons. So I should probably segue from this. The more serious reason we do this, I mean, are we playing, Rabbi Gotcha? Do we want to show the rabbis up that they disagree on these things? Of course not. So to explain sort of the deeper reason, and this is my last anecdote, I promise, I'll take you back to a scene that I think is familiar and perhaps beloved to everyone. That's a scene from Fiddler on the Roof. So think about Tevye trying to moderate or mediate a dispute between Perchik, the young radical who's just gotten off the train and who's later to become his son-in-law. So Perchik's arguing with the conservative villagers. And he says, and they're in a big argument, and he says, and then the villager says, what do we care what they think in Kiev? And Tevye says, you're right. And Perchik says, what do you mean? How can you say that? How could you not care about what other people think besides yourself? And Tevye says, you're right. And a third villager says, wait, he's right and he's right? How could they can't both be right? And Tevye thinks about this, and then he says, you're also right. So to me, that is all of Judaism in a nutshell. The two values that animate this collection: the Jewish love of argument and the fundamental Jewish ethic of tolerance for differing views. And I don't have to tell you, here I'm coming to you from Washington, I don't have to tell you that this principle has been on hard times lately. This is not a good time for people to honor the value of civilized disagreement. But it is a deeply, deeply Jewish value. Everyone knows the joke about the shipwrecked Jewish sailor who's he's alone on an island for 10 years. And so he builds 2 synagogues, the one he prays in and the one he wouldn't set foot in. So beyond that zest, so we have that. Beyond the zest for disputation, and I would say essential to it, driving it, is the spirit of generosity, the sense you can always learn something from somebody else's opinion. And this principle predates Tevye by many millennia. So let me stop there. Those are the 2 reasons we wrote the book, and let me go back to the rabbi's original question, which is about why ask this one question? Why ask, can robots be Jewish? And why name the book after it? So I said that we like to ask questions that get people thinking and where they will agree or disagree in interesting ways. A bad question would be a question where everyone agreed or disagreed in an uninteresting way. To ask whether a robot can be Jewish, first of all, you would think that it's a question the tradition has nothing to say about. But, that's our tradition. They say, turn it, and everything is in it. And it turns out that there's a lot about the questions that underlie this question. You're really asking what makes us human. To ask what could make a robot Jewish, you're asking what makes a person or a being Jewish. Like, what's the fundamental thing? And to ask that, you also have to ask, well, what makes us human? Do you have to be human to be Jewish? Well, what does that mean? So we have, the first thing that it turns out, there's a lot about this question in Torah and, well, in tradition anyway. And the obvious thing that has to do with the golem. A lot of rabbis immediately went to the question of, what do the sages say about the golem? And it turns out there's a lot of discussion in the Talmud about whether a golem can be counted in a minyan. So the golem, people probably remember, the golem is the man of clay made by certain mystical rabbis at various times to protect the Jewish community. And a lot of people, one of the things I learned from reading these answers is that the golem was one of the inspirations, it's generally thought, for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein monster. But the golem can be counted in a minyan under certain circumstances. And the question is, why? So the rabbis show their backgrounds a little bit on this. One of the interesting things I learned, this was definitely not a case where the liberal rabbis disagreed with the Chabad rabbis and the people in the middle were a spectrum, which you sometimes get, which you often get. For instance, can Jews get tattoos? A perfect spectrum from yes to no with a bunch of it depends in the middle. But in this case, first of all, I would say that the main thing I learned about rabbis from this question was that a lot of rabbis, I will say particularly the male rabbis, obviously had passed their teenage years as science fiction aficionados, or I might say geeks. Our modern Orthodox Rabbi Yitz Greenberg wrote this fabulous dialogue between him and his robot. It's shtick, but it's very thoughtful shtick. The robot says, "Of course I'm Jewish. I'm anxious." You look at the robot in Star Wars. He's anxious. He worries about everything. The rabbi responds, "That wasn't the Jewish character in Star Wars. The Jewish character in Star Wars was Han Solo because he was flawed. A flawed hero is very Jewish. The perfect hero is goyish. And the robot says, "But I celebrated Hanukkah." And the rabbi says, "Goyish again, Jews don't celebrate Hanukkah. We observe Hanukkah." And the robot finally says, "Aren't you, how awful that you're holding out on me with Jewish continuity, such a problem. Shouldn't you be accepting me? Shouldn't you be more encouraging to me? And also when you go see your grandchildren in Israel, you don't write to me, you don't call me." At which point the rabbi says, "Okay, you're Jewish." Yeah. So that's pretty obvious. But one of the rabbis who was not on the science fiction side of things called me. The rabbis do occasionally call me. Another sign of a good question is at least one rabbi will either call me or email him and say, "What kind of a question is this? What in the world are you looking for with this?" So we talk them down. And so this particular rabbi said to me, "I just have no idea what you want from this. This question conveys nothing to me." And so we talked for a little while, and eventually she said, "Well, I think my dog is Jewish. Like, my dog is the most excited person in the household, so to speak, about Shabbat. It seems to make him really happy." And so I was all right about that. So she ended up with this really lovely little meditation about how, according to some sources, to have a Yiddish neshama, a Jewish soul, requires basically that you have been loved and cared for by Jews, that you are important to Jews. And if that's the case, even a child's doll can in some sense be Jewish. And so she ends by saying, "Look, we've always been a mixed multitude, let them all in. There's enough blessing to go around." So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Was there anything surprising within those answers that, you don't a lot with science, like with genetic testing, genetic engineering issues going beyond robots. Anything surprising about rabbinic ideas and thoughts about these science? Because very often people don't turn to rabbis for scientific expertise. Were there some rabbis who really were experts in this? Were there things that were just kind of surprising that you found out about that?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, in many ways, this is the most interesting of the chapters. I say that about all the chapters. They're all my favorites. I mean, the first chapter is science, and there are 6 questions in there. And one of them is, should we edit our children's genes? And that was a case, again, I would have expected a little bit more of a spectrum of beliefs about that. This was just a few years ago, so CRISPR and all these fabulous new technologies were already in the air, and it was actually at a time when a researcher in China or Korea, I don't remember the details, had announced he had edited the actual germline of one of a pair of twins so she wouldn't get some disease. And so we made an effort to reach out to rabbis who might have an expertise in this. There are a lot of rabbis who are also doctors, who are also scientists. And I was entranced to learn, although it wasn't news to Rabbi Bergman, apparently, that JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, has a project running called Sinai and Synapses, which is just about questions about, I guess, neurology and halacha. And so we reached out to them. We reached out to some other people. I found that across the board, there was although most of the rabbis were, they expressed some concern about eugenics and things like that. But the rabbis who approached it philosophically largely said, it could be a good thing. You want to improve the human body and the experience where you can. Our modern Orthodox rabbi, who's very distinguished, Yitz Greenberg, pointed out that there's always been a tension between the sort of the tendency to respect the distinctions laid down by nature, and on the other hand, the ability to work with those and improve them. For instance, if you couldn't do that, then if Judaism were really not for scientific changing of the way things are, then you wouldn't even have agriculture, never mind, genetic editing. But the people who were the most against this were the actual scientist rabbis who knew more about what was happening. And those folks, I think there were three of them altogether, rabbi, doctor, scientists, one conservative, one Orthodox, one, I forget the third one. Anyway, they all said, no. This may sound like a good idea, but we are just not there. Like the difficulty of doing this and the danger of doing this at the moment so outweighs the philosophical considerations that it is just not time to go there. So I thought that added up to an interesting meditation on the tension between what science can actually do and what people might abstractly want it to do. But generally, the science questions indicated, one of the questions we asked was, is there a conflict between Judaism and science? And really, Judaism is a very science-friendly religion. There was a lot of joy in science expressed and a lot of wonder at the things that are possible. Organ donation was another case where they really had come to approve of it over the decades.
Yeah, no. So when you talk about that Judaism as sort of a science-friendly, is that but in terms of like the possibilities of what can be done, like with the genetics and organ donations, or did it get into a more cosmological point of view that people try to prove that the Torah can be understood scientifically? Did you notice kind of a difference when they talked about science, whether from kind of the engineering versus the more kind of philosophical point of view?
I would say the main feel. The views of sort of liberal-leaning rabbis about Judaism and science are not that different from the views you'd expect from, for instance, a minority culture living within a majority culture, which is to say this idea of sort of the Stephen Jay Gould idea of sort of non-overlapping magisteriums. You don't ask the same questions of science that you ask of Judaism. But in general, I think I was struck by the degree to which science is a fulfillment often of Jewish values. The scientists, they often refer to this interest in being partners with creation, the interest in being active partners with creation, with the idea of making life better for human beings, the idea that the work's not done. And this was something that was pretty much true across all the denominations, although the flavor was different. The flavor of some of the more traditional denominations. No one talked in this particular question about miracles. We just recently, too late to put it in the book, we asked a question, do Jews believe in miracles? And that was really fun. That was sort of the flip side, because they all went to Maimonides, who said, if there are miracles, they are coded in natural law from the very beginning. In other words, there's no conflict even there with science. So.
Here, and we have a question from a viewer. Do some of the rabbis in the book not believe in God? And that's a very wide question, because of course it's which God are you believing in or not believing in. But did you notice kind of like theological patterns? And again, if anyone out there watching, please feel free to put questions and comments for Amy, or for me, but mostly for Amy.
I'll answer, or for the rabbis, really. This is where I get to say, I'm not a rabbi, I just play one on Zoom. Yeah. But and I'm channeling these wonderful. There's a lot of insight packed into these 200-word things, and also in the patterns that they make between them. So, as I mentioned before, the only people for whom not believing in God is kind of a brand are the Jewish humanists. I think I don't know, if people are my age or older, they might remember a lot of fuss in the 80s and 90s about a bugaboo, like the secular humanists are out to get us. And these are not secular humanists at all. They're Jewish humanists. They're into Jewish culture and civilization, but they think that all of this can be accomplished without the supernatural, that all the best things about Judaism are free of the supernatural. That is definitely not a view expressed by any of the other rabbis. They all allude to God in the ways they understand them. I will say, Rabbi Bergman suggested the idea of theological patterns. I write in the introduction that you can see certain stylistic things. The Reconstructionist rabbis really love to quote Mordecai Kaplan, their founding eminence. Not all of them equally, but quite frequently they'll refer back, and you'd expect that of a young denomination that's very much an expression of a vision. The Chabad rabbis, of course, like to quote the Lubavitcher Rebbe. That's not surprising. The conservative rabbi always recommends further reading. Not always, okay, but our regular conservative rabbi, Amy Katz of Springfield, Massachusetts, has a wonderful assortment of to really understand this, you need to read this book, which collects 12 different rabbis. So it's further like ask the rabbi.
I was in school with her. I totally see that. Yeah.
Right. It's like the Morton Salt thing, right? If you ask this rabbi, she'll tell you to ask 10 more rabbis, who will tell you to ask 10 more rabbis, and so forth. But I think the best, I come away often thinking that these disagreements mask a certain deeper agreement. And I think the best example, and if you'll forgive me, I'll quote a little bit from the one question that we asked, which I was really proud of this question. We asked, and I was really pleased with the results. We asked, does the Torah provide, let me see what exactly it was. What does the Torah teach us about addiction? Now, obviously, the Torah doesn't teach us anything specifically about addiction to drugs. It's all going to be a matter of drawing parallels and seeing metaphors. But that's really the job of interacting with our tradition anyway, for rabbis and kind of for everybody. So the pattern here is fascinating. They all draw, first of all, they all see it in different places. They all quote different texts. The independent rabbi, Gershon Winkler, who is actually another interesting figure. He's an independent rabbi because he's got a thing called the Walking Stick Foundation. And basically he takes people on hikes in the great outdoors in California and talks to them about Torah and God. So that's a great denomination all by itself. And he starts by talking about the golden calf. And he says, addiction is the act of replacing a truth or a need or an innate desire or something real with an artificial facsimile that eventually supersedes the truth. So once you go that direction, he says, it's you got to be melted down and cast afresh to get free of that, just as happened with the golden calf. So that was interesting. The conservative rabbi looked to Exodus and talks about the exodus from Mitzrayim, from the narrow place. And she says the addict is like the Jews coming out of Egypt, constantly backsliding, struggling, starting again, continuing onward to this promised land, which itself is just a place for more challenges. Then you start looking, then you get the pairings, like the renewal rabbi talks about Shabbat as a rebuke to work addiction. Like if Shabbat tells you there should be nothing in your life that you can't step away from for 24 hours. The modern Orthodox rabbi uses almost exactly the same words to say this. Shabbat, I mean, he says other things too, but Shabbat, among other things, is a cure for work addiction. It's, of the two of them, it's the renewal rabbi, not the modern Orthodox rabbi, by the way, who notes that the biblical penalty for working on Shabbat was stoning. So that's a switch. I would have thought you would not hear about that from the more liberal rabbi. So then the Reform rabbi, Sari Laufer, looks to Noah, who comes out of the ark and sees the destruction of the world and promptly gets blind drunk. So then the other person who goes to that is the Chabad rabbi, Shais Taub, who starts by saying, Noah in this story is not out to have a good time. He's on a mission to blot out self-consciousness. And he then says, he talks about the pain of self-awareness on one hand and self-obliteration on the other. And he concludes, addiction is but the human condition writ large. We're only happy once we get over ourselves. That is recovery from addiction, when I realize the only way I can function is through extreme selflessness and surrender to a power greater than myself. So that's surrender to a power. That's not surprising. The humanist rabbi, to jump back to the left for you, Peter Schweitzer talks about Cain and Abel, and he says, when God rejects Cain's offering, he doesn't give up on Cain. Here's what he says to Cain. Why are you so angry? If you are to do what is good, shouldn't you hold your head high? If you don't do what is good, sin is crouching at the door. It wants you, but you can rule over it. This rabbi goes on to say, temptation is there, always ready to pounce, always ready to snare us. We could say the wrong word or waste time, but we can also, or self-medicate with alcohol or drugs, but we can also be master over it, not because we resort to prayer or turn to a higher power to pull us through. That is not what God says to Cain, but because we can take charge of our own actions and acknowledge our own human nature. So I thought the contrast here in wording between the humanist rabbi who says this is not about a higher power, this is about acknowledging our human nature and taking control of our actions with text, and the Chabad rabbi who says this is all about surrendering to a higher power and recognizing that we're powerless, they sound like complete opposites. But if you think about it, these are really not opposites. You convey different versions of the same sensibility, the cowering human being plucking up his internal resources before the void. So I don't know if that answers the question about belief in God, but maybe.
No, that's great. So it sounds like Jewish wisdom is more a process than an outcome.
Oh, that's fun. Yeah, I think that, the Jewish people are certainly a process. Jewish text is a process. There's the, one of the, I think it's a nice thought for an editor. I was described as the author of this book, but I'm really, all I wrote in this book was the introduction and the notes, and, it's more about selection and editing, but the process of struggling through these and figuring out what exactly the rabbis are trying to say and how they relate, that is definitely a process. And I think the process of Jewish wisdom, as you say, it's very tied up in this idea of fruitful disagreement. I was brought up listening to an expression from the rabbi I listened to who said, Elu ve'elu, these and these are the words of the living God. The words and these words both have something. And this is said in about, there's a dispute between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, and it ends with a voice from heaven saying, this one is right, but Ilu ve'ilu, Devarim Elohim Chaim. I'm paraphrasing. Elu ve'ilu. Someone told me I was pronouncing this wrong in a previous talk.
No, that's good.
But the idea of these words being a principle for all of Torah continues, as they say, kind of up till yesterday. The rabbis of the Talmud are part of it, and the discussions on Torah study on Zoom is part of it. So
Yeah, it is ironic that we have to do this on Zoom when we're talking about the roles of technology and Judaism. I imagine that's going to be a number of questions.
right, yeah.
We have one question from someone watching. Would the issues with social distancing and masks ever be asked, or is that too immediate and contentious?
So that's a great question. I will say first that too contentious is not a problem. We love contentious. We did ask. We actually, before this all happened, it's not in the book because it seemed a little too. I mean, these things are always in the magazine, and actually, if you can find them on the magazine's website, a lot of them. Although, of course, I'd rather you buy the book, and there's a lot extra stuff in the book that makes them clearer. But you can look at some of the other questions on the Moment website, and the question we asked about, it must be a little more than a year ago, was what role does virtual presence play in Jewish ritual and Jewish community? And at that time, the reason we asked it was because quite a few of us were interacting with synagogues that were struggling with the question of whether to live stream their services. And the conservative movement, I know, had a discussion about that and came out with I guess at the time, sort of a qualified but fairly firm yes. That there were a lot of places you could live stream, and it was a good discussion, and most of the rabbis were in favor of one kind of live stream or another, and a couple of them had real doubts about live streaming prayer services. And ironically enough, the one who had the most concerns about live streaming prayer services now leads the best live stream Shabbat service I've seen anywhere, maybe just because I'm very fond of this congregation, but just the greatest, does the best job with it. So I think we will ask this question again. The reason we haven't asked it during the pandemic because it's sort of a moving target. We have about a 6-week lead time for between the time we ask the question and the time that the magazine hits the newsstands. So it can be a little difficult. You don't want to ask a question that would be moot. Not that there's any danger of that, unfortunately. But I think we will come back to this and ask it. And one of the things that I see people discussing is this question of whether you can worship when social distanced it's kind of, I mean, we started, it's I won't say a second Yavna, but has a little bit of aspects of that. We started with a temple and all this very specific, very, very concrete forms of worship. And then that whole thing was reinvented so it could be done without the temple, which was its center. And here we are taking another step away from the real, and we're trying to figure out things that we can do that kind of remind us of things we did for real. And you can see a whole shadow religion popping up along those patterns. And, obviously you wouldn't want to have to stay with it. But I think if any tradition, if anybody's suited to making this work and figuring out how to make it meaningful, it would be rabbis with the kind of training and the kind of grounding in that kind of history.
Yeah, I think the training tells you in advance things will be different from anything you think it will be.
Right, exactly. There's one
today is just today.
Yeah, one of the things I like about the way one of the reasons the book we've been running this feature for 15 years, which isn't that long, and God knows in the scheme of Jewish history it's not very long, but it's a long time in journalism. And I've been editing it for 10 years, and we selected questions from all across that time period, and you can kind of see they are definitely snapshots of the time they were asked. Some of the sex questions, like what would you say if your child told you he was gay, we put them in because they're still good, but the vocabulary has changed a lot. The sort of the expectations have changed a lot. And the organ donation question, for instance, we asked it back in 2006, so it's changed a lot even since then, but each rabbi alluded to the fact that halacha has changed in response to evolving science. And Yitz Greenberg, the modern Orthodox rabbi, gives a really interesting history of the changes, not just in the community or in the world, but of this one distinguished Orthodox halachist, Moshe Feinstein, who kept changing his mind, basically based on new information. And I think that's a model that people don't always fully appreciate, an aspect of Judaism that people don't always realize.
Oh, absolutely. Definitely. Circumstances changes things so much. I know in Israel, one of the biggest changes when Elisa Flatto of blessed memory was murdered in a terrorist attack. And her parents insisted on her organs being donated. And she was an American. She had gone to Frisch in New Jersey. And unfortunately, she was studying in Israel when this terrible thing happened. And it was that one thing that changed an entire country. And their approach to the halakha, and that there was such a power in that. There was a question that's being asked by someone in the audience. In pulling these segments together, did you find there was consistency within the various branches of Judaism? That is, did the humanist rabbis agree with each other? The conservative rabbis agree with each other, etc.? Or was there even conflict within movements?
That's a great question. I mean, it's such a large question. I mean, it's hard to speak for all the rabbis. I'll work in with this. I see that there's a question in the chat about how we pick the rabbis, and these things sort of. So some of the denominations, we've been using a single rabbi for a long time. We've been using Yitz Greenberg to do modern Orthodox commentary for a long time. We've been going mostly, although there was more variation over the years. In recent years, we've had one conservative rabbi who's answered all the questions, Amy Katz of Springfield, Massachusetts. And so obviously those rabbis don't disagree with themselves. I would say that on specific points of law, there's not much disagreement inside of a denomination, even a kind of a loosey-goosey denomination well, I don't want to characterize a denomination like that, but we do. I think I see more the answers are characterized, if anything, by the boundaries they won't go past. So if you ask a question about that could be answered halachically, but it's tempting to just answer it in general, you might get, for instance, we asked two politics questions. Again, we didn't put many of our politics questions in the book because they get dated, but we did ask two questions about politics generally. One was, is democracy a Jewish idea? And the other one is, are we commanded to vote? So the answer to the first question, I mean, obviously democracy is not a Jewish idea, but it's such a good idea. Everyone wants to claim some piece of it. So rabbis would talk about, it's not democracy per se, obviously, but the value of the human person, the idea that the B'Tselem Elohim is in some sense the root of all democracy. And as far as being commanded to vote, we had a lot of people talking about all the reasons it's a great idea to vote. And then the Orthodox rabbi, Yitzhak Adlerstein, the not modern Orthodox rabbi, I guess, for lack of a better term, started by saying, there's so many ways to answer this question, but you're making it easy by using the word commanded, because there are really only two ways to answer this question as a matter of halakha. And so, his answers weren't that different from everybody else's, but it was plain that he understood the limits of how you answer a question like that in a slightly different way. The Chabad rabbis, there's a lot of stuff they won't say. And I guess the one story I tend to tell is we had a question about contraception. Basically just the general question, does Jewish law offer any guidance on contraception? And much to our astonishment, it turns out, first of all, Jewish law offers lots and lots of guidance on contraception. You might think contraception is an aspect of modernity, but obviously it really isn't. This problem, this impulse to solve this particular problem goes right back to the beginning, obviously. And so the older rabbis,
teenager, I believe.
Sorry?
When the first teenager was created, I believe
exactly
discussions began.
Oh, yes, you're in my house apparently. So the most of the rabbis cited a few of the same things, that there's Jewish law does not disapprove of contraception. The commandment to be fruitful and multiply applies only to men, that there's a technical reason it doesn't apply to women because you can't command someone to do something that puts them at risk. So men are commanded to reproduce themselves as much, ideally with a boy and a girl, but beyond that, it's all optional and cultural. And even the Orthodox rabbis said, like the Orthodox Rabbi Yitzhak Adlerstein said, it's not really the Jewish way to limit your family size so you can go skiing, but it is the Jewish way to make sure that your family is going to be healthy, and that there's various reasons that even very Orthodox rabbis might advise a family to space its children in various ways. So the Chabad rabbi, with Chabad, we use a lot of different rabbis depending on their expertise. And I have direct relationships with a lot of different Chabad rabbis who are good at specific things. But in this case, I called the general Chabad communications rabbi whom I've known for many years and whom I really like, and who called me back in anguished tones and said, look, we really think this question should only be answered by a woman. So I said, well, this is an ask the rabbis, so we need a rabbi. And he said, look, I promise you these women are just as good as rabbis. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay, I'm not going to have a fight with you, but we actually need a rabbi. And, that's your problem, that they're just as good as rabbis, but they're not rabbis. I didn't actually say that. And he came back. He came back to me at the very end, right before deadline, right when we'd held a spot for this answer because it hadn't come in. And he called, he said, we're just not going to do it. I hope you understand. And I said, sure. And I couldn't make out whether the problem was that they had a stringent position that they thought would look bad and they didn't want that position to be in print, or if they had a generous, a liberal position that they thought would look bad. This is more likely that they knew perfectly well, like that the only way they couldn't make a textual argument for astringency, and so they didn't want to be in print saying contraception was okay. So that's a case of an example. And there's a lot of rabbis to the right of Chabad who don't really want to be in this feature, and sometimes we can get them to, depending on the topic, but really often not. And my feeling about that is that the limits of Elu are different for everybody. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not going to judge. I have limits on what views I consider legit. And if they don't want to appear in a forum that legitimizes, female rabbis, secular, humanist rabbis who don't believe in God, then, okay, I get it. So yeah. So I don't know if that answers the question about limitations.
Great, thank you. And there's another question of who comes up with the questions to ask the rabbis? What is the process?
So one of the joys of my life is the editorial meetings where we come up with these questions. Moment's a nice group. We have a wonderful group of editors, and we have an editorial meeting for every issue in which we come up with really a lot of the story ideas, but we kick them around. We try to figure out, again, we're working on about a 6-week delay, maybe a little less if we're being extremely efficient. So, you want to try to think like, what are people going to be worrying about, or what's going to be in the news a month to 6 weeks from now? There are winter questions, there are summer questions, there are holiday related questions. And then you really want something. You just kick it around. You really want something fresh. You want something new. We had a long, difficult meeting once a couple of years ago about what to ask for Passover. We really wanted a question people would argue about at the Seder. And it's really hard to find a question that hasn't already been asked about the Haggadah and the Seder, right? I mean, this is pretty well-trodden ground. And eventually we're just trying to figure out something that would bother people, but not that much that they couldn't, it would be bothering people, but it wouldn't be something that everyone agreed bothered them, or that, or that was narrow and technical. You really don't want a narrow technical answer. Like you ask 10 rabbis, what's the rule on X? And they'll just tell you the rule. That's not an interesting feature. So in the end, we came up with, should Jews at the Seder call on God to smite their enemies? Mm-hmm. Which is a part of the Haggadah, which some people use. And I mean, for some people, it's very powerful, to that point at the end where you stand up and say, pour out thy wrath upon the nations that know you not. And some people find that horrendous, and it's been dropped from some Haggadah long ago. So that was a great question. I really enjoyed that question.
Were there questions that like you wanted to ask, but you knew you just couldn't?
We have not had any such question. It's funny. Everyone asks me that. I'm up for asking anything, really. I mean, my favorite questions, the rabbis, I like prodding the rabbis a little bit, you know. I like making them call up and say, "What? What do you mean?" You know, then that a good month. At least one rabbi will do that. Will either call me or email me and say, "What in the world is this question about? What are you talking about?" And we have one right now about surveillance, and at least one rabbi had no idea what I was getting at. And I said, well, you know, think of it this way, think of it that way. So, you know, stay tuned, right? I mean, that's for the January, February issue. There's one question where that actually made it into the text, which is we asked a question some years ago, should Jews strive to be happy? And Yitz Greenberg's answer starts out, what kind of a question is this? Should Jews strive to be healthy? Should they strive to eat? You know?
Yeah, that's why Hebrew has no word for fun. We had to borrow it from Arabic. That's something about us. We have meaningful, we have satisfied, but we don't have a word for fun.
Right. We do have a lot of words for happy, though, it turns out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's
move to maybe some of the social issues. What were some of the, you know, what are social issues today that wouldn't have even been on someone's radar, 100 years ago? And what are some of the surprises and challenges within those issues?
Well, it's funny because, I mean, we're always trying to ask questions like that, but they're always there before us, you know? I mean, the classic, the main example would have to be the question about dealing with transgender issues. We asked a question, the exact question was, does the tradition offer any guidance? Let me find the table of contents. What guidance, if any, does Judaism offer transgender people? I think in the magazine we were able to say, or those of indeterminate gender. So the first thing you find out is that the rabbis of the Talmud, going back to the beginning, recognize up to 5 genders with terms for them all. There's the tumtum, who is a person whose gender doesn't match his or her genitalia or is otherwise in some kind of doubt. And there's a lot of law on the tumtum, who I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. Anyway,
no, that's right, yeah.
That's weird. The tumtum can inherit as a son or be supported by the estate of the parents as a daughter, and can initiate marriage or be taken in marriage, depending on other factors. There's a category called the androgyne. That's a Greek word, but it basically means an intersex person with both or no genders. There's the saris, and there's the one that begins as this thing and becomes another. And anyway, there's a lot of law about these questions. And if you go back and think about it, you can say, look, in the world of the ancients, you know, first of all, presumably things about our human nature go back to as long as we've been human. You know, problems come up and you have to deal with them. But, you know, this was also a world where people, where there were eunuchs, you know, where people were forcibly castrated. And so naturally there's going to be law on people whose gender or sexuality was forcibly changed. So that was one example. We did ask a question about we've asked questions about social media. One time we asked a question, what are the sins? And this is in the book. What sins should we atone for in our use of social media? This was a Yom Kippur question. Basically, one of my favorite of the answers was, it's funny if you read down the classic vidui, the confessional, it's funny how many of those sins seem to have anticipated social media. You know, it's about gossip and slander and running to do evil and running to bear tales. It's like, you know, we're doing, so they're good answers. They're funny answers because the rabbis bring modern life, but to suggest that they are somehow new answers would be stretching a point. I will say there's one answer. One question we asked, which we felt like the ground was really shifting under it, was we asked, is silence consent? And that's really a Me Too question, but we wanted to make it as open-ended as possible. And we got quite an interesting range of answers about silence. Silence is the Reconstructionist rabbi, the renewal rabbi, talked about the silence of Tamar being told to be silent about her rape by her. This is the daughter, one of the daughters of the children of Solomon. I'm not going to read from it, but I remember there was after she's told not to speak about this, she's never heard from again. We don't hear her voice after that. Some of the rabbis talked, a lot of them talked about, well, in some cases silence is golden, and in some cases silence is poisonous. And the Orthodox rabbi noted the difference in power. When you're the powerful person, silence can be a great thing. When you're the powerless person, it means something else entirely. And the Sephardic rabbi, I think, was the one who pointed out that one of the reasons given for the fall of the temple was someone's silence before a slight to a rabbi. There's a story, a lot of you may know this story about
my senior sermon, actually. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So correct.
That's right. It's like the difference between wanting your kids just to be quiet, you don't care who started it, versus creating a sense of calm. But yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that was your point, your sermon?
No, that was just with the idea of what a healthy silence versus an unhealthy. I know when my kids were at it, I didn't care who did what, just be quiet.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah.
That's not healthy. So let me ask you, we're coming toward the end of the conversation, which I can't believe, but how do you think about things differently Jewishly? Has this affected your approach to Judaism, how you think about Jewish practice and thought? Do you still want to be Jewish at the end of this?
Well, I will say one of my really proudest moments about this whole thing was my son, who, when he was a freshman in college, he took some copies of Moment with him, and he had asked for a roommate who shared his opinions on, had the same interests as he had, but a different background. So they sent him a Pakistani Muslim from Texas, and they are the best of friends. But the thing that his Muslim roommate couldn't get over was ask the rabbis. He just couldn't believe that Judaism was set up that way. And I've always had this sort of daydream about, like, could you do this? Like, could you do a guest column? Could you do an Ask the Imams? Or, would it work? How would it work? And, I just don't know enough about other traditions to say it would work. But I'm so delighted by this. And I'm always amazed, truly, every time we get another question in. And sometimes, you're a little too close to it. Sometimes I'll edit all the things and I'll send them in and I'll say, this one wasn't that good. They're all obvious. And then the editors at Moment were like, no, this one's really interesting. Who knew that all these different people had all these views? So I've always been kind of a softie on this stuff, and it's just getting worse and worse.
So let me ask a question that came up, and it's a very good question. We haven't talked about your readers yet. So do the readers get very angry or upset over many of the answers? Do the debates continue in the letters to the editor?
Sometimes. That's a very good question. Silence is Consent got a lot of interesting letters to the editor. I have noticed, as I'm sure we're not the first publication to notice, that the actual letters are quite civilized, but the online stuff is just wacky. We've had ideas over the years about ways to extend this, to bring this into an online forum. And it seems like it would be a great forum for online discussion, but our sense is that maybe it was just a shortcoming in my organizational skills, but it seems like rabbis don't really care to argue with other rabbis online in print by name. Maybe it's just too, maybe they just know each other too well, or it's disrespectful or something. But so we don't get a lot of that, but the readers are very lively about this, and as you'd expect, they mostly write in when they're angry. What kind of a question is this? It's the classic Jewish, right, answer to a question. First you're infuriated, and then you're kind of interested, and then you take it up.
Yeah, there would absolutely be an issue with, instead of robots, of bots in these conversations. How would you know who was an actual human?
Right. I think the Messianic Jews use bots because they're always right there with the Jews for Jesus people. As if we ask a question that is even remotely I mean, they must just be searching online for references to God and just like they're always in there with a question. But you know, we do curate our website a little bit, so I'm not sure that always turns up.
So let me just finish with this. What brings you hope with this? We could all use a little bit right now in these strange days. So you've been doing this for a while. The column's been going for a while. What brings you hope in all this?
It's a very good question, because it's true. It seems as if, you know, here while I'm sitting here talking about how great it is that Jews love to disagree with amity, you know, it seems like the community is moving the other direction. There are a lot of people who won't talk amicably or at all, and who just jump to call, you know, the other guy's a capo, or you know, the other guy's not a Jew at all, or the other guy's a self-hater. And you know, that's always been the case. My father used to tell this joke about people when he was growing up. You know, there were people who had decided to only wait 1 hour between milk and meat. And, you know, his family waited 3 hours. So these people, he said, we always felt the people who waited 1 hour were really not Jews at all. And the people who waited 6 hours, fanatics, you know? So in some sense, I feel like it's probably always been like this. You notice it more with social media. So when I interact with these rabbis that I am sure we don't agree on a thing, but we have lovely interactions, great conversations, you know, that gives me hope. I mean, I treasure my relationships with some of these rabbis that are regulars. So I think the Jewish people will come through in the end.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I think that is a great way to end. I want to thank Amy E. Schwartz so much for the conversation, for a truly wonderful book. And
Hanukkah present.
Here, show it. Yeah, there he is. Yeah,
What's saying? Makes a great present.
Can Robots Be Jewish? And it can be ordered through the book fair website. And just hopefully see you all in person someday. And now turn this over to Sandy Matz.
Thank you, Amy and Rabbi Bergman for ending on such a wonderful note about hope. I know we all could use hope these days. And thank you to all of you at home for joining us. Our next event is Once a Girl, Always a Boy, a family memoir of a transgender journey by Joe Ivester at 4 p.m. today. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website, once again, culturalarts.jccdet.org/book fair for our full schedule and ways to get involved. Have a great rest of your day.